If you are not yet a member, please join us. You can go to the membership page on our website, travisaudubon.org. The weather tonight makes me glad that we have these virtual options for our meeting. I hope that everyone is staying warm. And thank you again for joining us on Zoom. We are hopeful that we will be out of COVID stage 5 very soon, and we'll be excited to resume our in-person events. Travis Audubon was founded in 1952, which means we turned 70 years old this year. We are already planning some very special celebrations and remembrances. So I hope you'll stay tuned for some announcements in February about ways you can join in and celebrate this milestone with us. We have some fun things planned. And finally, one last announcement. If you would please mark your calendars, we are making plans for an in-person birdathon for the entire month of April. We are hoping to offer some incredible opportunities to bird in Central Texas and all over the state. And we hope you'll join us in one of our most important fundraisers of the year. So more information about that soon. Now, as we get started, you know what we like to do. I thank you in advance for muting your microphone and turning off your camera to minimize distractions. You can enter questions in the chat for the Q&A session at the end. Don't hold back. Nathan just promised us that he'll answer questions for as long as we want to. And you can look for the recording of this meeting on our YouTube channel after we're done. So now I'll turn it over to our friend, Jane Tillman. Hi, Jane.
Hello, Nicole. I will go ahead and introduce Nathan. So if you're wondering how to pronounce Nathan's last name, it's Pieplow, Nathan Pieplow, P-E-E-P-L-O-W, if that helps you with the pronunciation, but it's really Pieplow, but his name is pronounced Pieplow. He grew up in South Dakota and started learning bird song and bird calls from the classic Peterson Birding by Ear series. But in 2003, Nathan was getting ready to go to Mexico and Costa Rica and got really frustrated with the resources that he had available to learn more bird songs. And he decided then to become dedicated to finding a new and better way to learn, describe, and catalog bird sounds. Along the way, he became an accomplished sound recordist and an amateur ethologist, which is a student of animal behavior. So Nathan wanted to learn bird sounds, and he needed more resources, more recordings, more glossaries, and more discussion of the same. So he wrote 2 books, and I have one of them, and I recommend that you check them out. He wrote the Peterson Field Guide to Bird Sounds of Eastern North America, and a couple of years later, the Guide to Western North America came out. And you can learn more about Nathan at his website, and basically the resources at his website, Ear Birding, are just really, really good. So Nathan is dialing in from Boulder, Colorado, where he teaches writing and rhetoric at UC Boulder. He's a former editor of the journal Colorado Birds and one of the developers of the Colorado County Birding website and the Colorado Birding Trail. You may have seen his name pop up on eBird in early November when he found a rare social flycatcher in the valley, and I'm hoping that he'll tell us a little bit of that story. It's a pretty great bird. But tonight he's going to focus on the language of birds. So please welcome Nathan Pieplow.
Thank you so much, Jane, and thank you to Travis Audubon for having me. It's great to visit you. I wish I could visit in person. I have now been to more than half of the counties in Texas, but I have never been to Austin. And that is a big hole. I've been meaning to go to Austin and trying to get to Austin, and the pandemic keeps keeping me away, unfortunately. So thanks so much. I'm going to share my screen so that you can see my slides. Tonight, I want to talk about the language of birds, and we can then talk about all sorts of other questions that you have at the end. And as Jane said, you can put your questions in the chat as we go, and then we'll get to them at the end. On the screen here, you see our friend, the common yellowthroat, and you see that squiggly shape up above my name. on the screen here, that is the bird's song. That is a spectrogram of the bird's song, a computer-generated picture of the sound. And we're not going to spend any time tonight worrying about how to read spectrograms. I will just let you know that you can, in fact, read bird sounds with practice. It's a bit like reading music, same basic idea. It goes from left to right. The high notes are at the top, the low notes are at the bottom. But during this talk tonight, occasionally you may see some funny shapes appearing on the screen when a bird sings. And if you see that, I just wanted to let you know that what you're looking at is a spectrogram, which is a picture of the sound. I like to say that all around us, all the time, the birds are always telling us who they are and what they're doing. But a lot of us don't understand them because we don't speak bird. That is something we can remedy. We can learn what birds are actually doing and saying by learning the words of their language. Here's an example. That bird just told you it was a red-winged blackbird. It also told you that it was a male. It also told you a few other things, but we'll get to that in a second. That bird also told you that it was a red-winged blackbird. It told you that it was a female, and it told you a few other things, which we'll get to in a second. If we learn the language of the birds, we can learn what they're up to, what's motivating them, and their behavior. For example, that's a cliff swallow. You're probably familiar with cliff swallows nesting in big colonies under bridges and in culverts. And if you walk up to the bridge where all the cliff swallows are nesting and you get close to the nests, all the cliff swallows will fly out of the nests and they'll start to circle over your head and they will make this sound. Because that little tiu syllable is the word in cliff swallow language that means danger. Cliff swallows have other words in their language as well, like this one. That is a sound that cliff swallows only make on cool, cloudy days. Because on cool, cloudy days, it becomes difficult to be a cliff swallow. Because cliff swallows feed on swarms of flying insects. And when it's misty and cloudy and raining and cool, there are far fewer insects flying. So what the birds do on those cool, cloudy days is they spread out from the colony in all directions, hoping that one of them will get lucky and find a swarm of insects that's actually flying despite the weather. If they do, in fact, get lucky and find this swarm of flying insects, they make this sound. And that immediately recruits all the other members of the colony within earshot to come as quickly as they can and take advantage of that swarm of flying insects while they're still on the wing. Now, it's possible that other species of swallow have food finding calls like this one. But if they do, we don't know about it. And in fact, the only reason we know this word in cliff swallow language is because there was one cliff swallow researcher who kept going back year after year to the same colony of cliff swallows in Nebraska to study them for over 20 straight years. And it was somewhere around year 14 or something when they figured out that this call existed and did a pretty ingenious set of experiments to figure out what it actually meant. The vast majority of bird species have never been studied nearly that well. So a lot of the time, we actually don't know what the birds are saying. There remains a ton to learn about even common birds and how they're using sounds to communicate. This is one of the things I love most about bird sounds, is that anytime you are studying bird sounds, you are standing very close to the frontier of human knowledge. It's much, much easier to go out in your backyard and record a bird sound that's never been recorded before than it is to take your camera anywhere and take a photo of a bird that's never been taken before. So this is a theme that I'm going to be coming back to a few times during the night, is how much we have to learn. And I hope to impress upon you by the time we're done here tonight, what contributions you actually can make to our knowledge of bird sounds. So tonight we're going to talk a lot about what the birds are actually saying to one another. And we're going to start with this pair of red-winged blackbirds that we've already met. And we're actually going to come back to them more than once during the talk tonight, because red-winged blackbirds are one of the best studied birds in North America. So we actually have a very good handle on their vocal communication. We have a pretty good idea what they're saying to one another. And also because red-winged blackbirds are without a doubt the most vocally interesting birds in North America. They have a lot going on. They have a lot to say to one another, and they have some fascinating ways of saying it. You're probably familiar with the song of the male red-winged blackbird, that konkari that we heard a little bit earlier. All across North America, the males sound more or less like that when they're singing. You may not be familiar with the fact that the female also has a song. You heard it a couple minutes ago in this talk. It's more of a cheer kind of call. You may not be familiar with that sound, even though female red-winged blackbirds make it all the time. And you may not realize that male and female red-winged blackbirds, when they are a mated pair, they often duet. The way it works is that the male starts his song, and halfway through his song, which means about half a second after he starts, the female starts her song. So he starts it off, they overlap for a little bit in the middle, and she finishes it out at the end. And it sounds like this. Now that is a duet between a mated pair. If you hear a male and female red-winged blackbird duetting like that, that means that they are pair bonding. They're telling each other, I love you. They're strengthening their pair bond. This is actually a really good thing to be able to recognize if you're doing breeding bird atlas work or breeding bird route surveys, is to be able to understand that you actually have a pair here. If you've been in a marsh where there are a lot of red-winged blackbirds, you've probably heard this duet many, many times, but you might not have recognized that it was a duet. You might not have recognized it because first of all, because the two songs sound so different. Secondly, because they don't start at exactly the same time. They're slightly staggered. And thirdly, because the two birds, when they're duetting, they might be right next to each other, but they might not be. The male might be up on his song perch and the female might be down hidden in the reeds near the nest. Or those two birds might be 50 yards apart. But if you were consistently hearing this pattern where the male sings and then halfway through his song, the female gives her call, that is a duet in this species. Several related species of birds do the exact same thing. Meadowlarks do the exact same thing. The female has a rattle call in both eastern and western meadowlarks. The male will give his song, and halfway through his song, the female will give her rattle call in response. Those two birds could be 100 yards apart on the prairie, and yet they are letting you know, and they're letting all the other meadowlarks in the area know that they are a mated pair. Brown-headed cowbirds do the exact same thing. Female has a rattle call, male has his kukui song, and halfway through his song, the female responds with her rattle call. This type of thing helps us understand when we're listening to a mated pair. Now, let's go back to this pair of red-winged blackbirds. When they do this duet, they're not just telling each other, I love you. They're also sending a message to all the other red-winged blackbirds in the marsh. They're also saying, I'm taken. Or, to be more precise, they're saying, my mate is taken. The male red-winged blackbird will defend the female against other males. The female red-winged blackbird will defend her male against other females. And so this actually is a signal, not just to each other, but also to all the other blackbirds in the marsh, saying this territory is occupied by a mated pair. Now, male red-winged blackbirds actually have two different kinds of songs. The much more common one is the one we just heard, the concarri, but they also have a rarer song that we call the flight song because it's almost always given in flight. And each individual male has his own specific flight song that only he gives. Each individual has a slightly different version than any other male. We're not 100% sure exactly what the flight song means in a red-winged blackbird, but here's our best guess. Our best guess is that male is advertising to his mate that he's about to leave the territory, so she's going to have to hold down the fort while he's gone. This is because usually this song is given when the male is flying away from his territory. However, males do not give this song every time they fly away from their territory, and occasionally they give it when they are headed back to their territory. So it's not entirely clear exactly what the flight song means. Again, that flight song might be something that you've heard before in the marsh, but you might not have recognized it as a song because it sounds like a whole bunch of call notes strung together, which is what it is. And each male chooses the call notes that he's going to string together in what order. Usually there's a couple of those sear, down-slurred whistles somewhere near the start of that flight song. But it is a song. And so this is something that you can listen for when you are near red-winged blackbirds. The female red-winged blackbird also has two different songs. There's the one we just heard, the I'm taken / I love you song. But female red-winged blackbirds also have a more aggressive song that they give when they're defending their territory or their mate against other females. And you can hear that one is harsher than the other one, more aggressive. Now, female red-winged blackbirds can actually express a range of emotions in between I love you and get out of my territory by kind of mixing and matching the sounds from those two different kinds of songs. So it's a continuum. So it gives them a wide range of vocal expression. In bird language, sometimes a single sound can have many meanings. And that shouldn't be too surprising because human language works the same way. In English, we have a number of words that sound the same but mean different things. And when we use those words in English, we figure out which meaning is intended from the context. Birds do the exact same thing. So for example, here's a little ruby-crowned kinglet. Up on the breeding grounds in the mountains of Colorado in the summer, this bird sings a long, beautiful, complicated song. But during the winter, when it's down in Texas, the ruby-crowned kinglet doesn't have as many sounds that it makes during the winter. In fact, most of what you're going to hear from a ruby-crowned kinglet during the winter is simply this chit-chit kind of call that it gives over and over. That chit-chit call has to serve multiple functions for a ruby-crowned kinglet all winter long. First of all, it warns of danger. Secondly, it keeps a flock together as a contact call. And in fact, if the ruby-crowned kinglet finds something like a screech owl that it wants to mob and recruit other small birds to drive that owl away, it would also use this same call for that as well. So how do other ruby-crowned kinglets and other birds in the area know which meaning is intended? Well, they do it the same way that we do it. They do it by context. So they would pay attention to what's going on. They would pay attention to how this bird is acting. They would pay attention to how agitated it seems, whether his little red crest is popped up, whether he's moving slow or fast, whether he's calling a lot or just a little bit, whether he seems to be feeding nonchalantly or seems to be keying in on danger somewhere. And so by paying attention to the context, they would figure out which meaning this ruby-crowned kinglet is sending. But if one sound can have many meanings, in bird language, it's also true that sometimes one meaning can have many sounds. And our example here is going to be the bird species that, as far as we know, has the largest vocabulary of any bird species in the world. And it's a bird that's common in parts of Texas. Now, it's not the mockingbird, but it is a relative of the mockingbird. On average, it has a vocabulary, as far as we know, that is 10 times larger than a mockingbird. And I'm talking about the brown thrasher. Now, that little caveat, as far as we know, is actually a really big caveat, because very few of the world's bird species have been really, really well studied, well enough that we can actually say how large their vocabulary is. But this brown thrasher, as far as we know, is the current world record holder. You may be familiar with the brown thrasher's song. When they're singing, they sing a phrase that's about a second long, and then they pause for about a second. And then they sing a different phrase that's about a second long. And then they pause for about a second. And then they sing a different phrase that's about a second long, and then they pause. And so the question is, how many different phrases does one brown thrasher know? I'm going to play you a little bit of brown thrasher's song, and you can kind of listen to it and see if you can tell when the bird starts to repeat itself. If you couldn't detect that bird repeating itself, that's because in that 40-second clip, that brown thrasher did not repeat itself even once. It sang entirely new song phrases every single time. So some researchers wanted to find out how many phrases a brown thrasher can sing. So a famous bird researcher and author named Donald Kreutzma, back in the 1980s, took one of his grad students out onto the campus of the University of Massachusetts, and they recorded a single singing brown thrasher for 118 straight minutes. So just shy of 2 hours. And then they took all that recording back to the lab, and they did their best to figure out how many unique phrases that bird had sung during those 2 hours. And then tried to extrapolate out to what its entire vocabulary might be. They had to extrapolate and use a bunch of statistical analyses and estimates. But when they were done, they estimated that that individual male brown thrasher could sing between 2,000 and 2,500 different song phrases. Just to put that in perspective, your vocabulary as an adult speaker of English is probably on the order of 25,000 words. So here's a bird that has a vocabulary maybe 10% the size of yours, and its brain is the size of your fingernail. But as astonishing as that is, it's possible that when they're remembering all those song phrases, brown thrashers are saving some brain space. Because as far as we've been able to tell, every single one of those 2,000 to 2,500 different song phrases in brown thrasher language means the exact same thing. Every single one of those song phrases means I'm a brown thrasher and I'm looking for someone to share my territory with. Which immediately raises the question, why do you need 2,500 different ways to say that? And the short answer is, we have no idea. Science has not yet explained how the brown thrasher's vocabulary got so big and why it is 10 times larger than a mockingbird's. The classic explanation would be what we call sexual selection, also known as female choice. The idea being that at some point in the evolutionary history of the brown thrasher, females developed a preference for males who did not repeat themselves. And so the males with the larger vocabularies became the ones who were more successful at finding mates and passing their genes on to the next generation. And over time, the vocabulary grows. That's the classic explanation, but I think it doesn't explain how the brown thrasher vocabulary got so large or why it is remaining so large. And here's why. If you think about it, if you're a female brown thrasher and you've got two males to choose from, and one of them has a vocabulary of 2,200 song phrases, and the other one has a vocabulary of 2,500 song phrases, and you want the guy with 2,500, think about what it would take for you to detect that difference. You would have to listen to both of those males, probably for hours, if not days. You would have to remember every single thing that came out of both of their mouths and be counting or memorizing as you go so that you would recognize when they start repeating themselves. And we're pretty sure that female brown thrashers are not putting in that much effort. So it seems that the vocabulary of this bird has grown larger than the ability of the female to perceive it, or at least than the willingness of the female to put in the time to count. And so that to me is a huge mystery that needs solving. Why do brown thrashers have so many song phrases? This is a super common bird that lives in tons of people's backyards all across the eastern United States, and we know very little about its vocabulary size. In fact, only one individual brown thrasher has ever had its vocabulary size estimated. And many, many bird species in the United States have never had that type of estimate applied to them at all. We have estimates for mockingbirds and brown thrashers. I don't think we have estimates for any other thrashers or catbirds or a lot of birds that have large vocabularies, like goldfinches, for example. We don't have a good estimate of how many different sounds they make. This is one of the really cool things about learning bird sounds and studying bird sounds, is that this is the kind of contribution that you could make in your backyard just by holding up your phone and recording birds. Or if you wanted to get into it, do more of a research project, this is the kind of thing you could do in your neighborhood and learn something that nobody has ever learned before about bird sounds. That's what really gets me excited about this. All right, so we just saw how in bird language, sometimes one sound can have many meanings, sometimes one meaning can have many sounds, and sometimes it's complicated. And to talk about this, we're going to come back to our good friends, the red-winged blackbirds. Only now we're going to talk about their calls instead of their songs. So, when a male red-winged blackbird is not singing during the breeding season and not nest building or feeding or doing anything else, what he's probably doing is sitting up on top of a cattail stalk in the marsh, giving calls. And a lot of those calls are going to sound like chuck, some version of chuck. Some of them might sound like seer, a whistled call. Each individual male red-winged blackbird knows between 12 and 20 of these chuck and seer type calls. And these are what we call the alert calls. in this species. Here's what some of them sound like. So there's 10 different calls from a male red-winged blackbird. That might be half of one male's vocabulary, because each male knows 12 to 20 different calls of this type. And the reason we call them alert calls is because the birds give them while they're alert, while they're sitting up, kind of watching over the marsh. They will pick one of the 12 to 20 different calls that they know, and they will give it over and over and over. And all the other red-winged blackbird males in that same marsh will be giving that same call over and over and over. They'll echo each other. You'll hear the same chuck call being given by all the males at irregular intervals. It turns out that if you go to one marsh, typically all the males in that marsh will share a vocabulary. They will all know the same 12 to 20 different alert calls. If you drive 50 miles down the road and go to another marsh full of male red-winged blackbirds, each male there will also know 12 to 20 different alert calls, but there'll be a different set than the ones in the marsh 50 miles back. So there's geographic variation, but in any one marsh, there's kind of a local dialect. There's a local agreement on which 12 to 20 calls those males are going to use. Researchers noticed that when danger arrived, like a hawk or a researcher, the calls would change. The males would all be giving one call, and then the danger would appear, and the males would all collectively switch to a different call. And that suggested a reason why we might have 12 to 20 different alert calls in red-winged blackbirds. Maybe those different calls are sending different messages. Maybe those different calls are referring to different kinds of danger, different types of predators, for example. Maybe they're referring to the direction that the danger is coming from. Maybe they're giving levels as to how dangerous it is, how threatening it is, how serious the threat, how close it is. These were all possibilities. So the researchers wanted to find the answer. So they got themselves a stuffed Cooper's hawk on a stick. And then they got themselves a bed sheet and a really long string, so that they could take the stuffed Cooper's hawk on the stick out into the marsh and stick the stick in the mud in front of a red-winged blackbird's favorite perch. And then they could put the bed sheet over the stuffed Cooper's hawk and then walk a long ways back with the string. Wait for the red-winged blackbirds to all forget that the researchers had been there. And then they could whip that bed sheet off, and from the perspective of the male red-winged blackbird, it would be like a Cooper's hawk suddenly appeared right in front of him. And then they would record the calls before and after the hawk appeared. So for example, let's say they go into the marsh, all the males are giving this call. One male gives it, another one echoes, another one echoes. The researchers whip that bed sheet off, and the calls change. What would happen is the first male to see the hawk would switch to a different call. And then as soon as he switched, all the other males within earshot would immediately follow suit. They would switch to that same new call that the first male had switched to. So the researchers thought, okay, well, maybe that seer is the hawk alarm call. So they tried the experiment again. Let's say that before the hawk shows up, they're all giving this call. The hawk appears. And they switch to that call. Try again. Before the hawk shows up, all the males are giving this call. That bed sheet comes off. And they switch to that call. What the researchers found after doing this experiment over and over again is that it didn't matter which call the male red-winged blackbirds switched to when the hawk showed up. What mattered was that they switched calls. In other words, it is the switch in calls that carries the message. The individual words in this language are meaningless. The actual calls themselves don't mean anything. Any call repeated over and over again means all clear in red-winged blackbird language. And any switch from one call to another means danger. So it's not the words in the language that carry the message. It is the syntax, the relation of those words to one another in time. That's where the meaning is. When I learned about this, it completely blew my mind because I had no idea that any kind of language or communication system could work this way. And I love this because it's a wonderful example that reminds us that we are not the only creatures on this planet that have had to face the challenge of figuring out how to communicate with sound. A lot of other species have figured this out, and they have figured out totally different ways to do it than we have. We're so used to thinking that bird language is similar to human language. Sometimes it's really, really not similar to human language at all. And that's fascinating and a good reminder. This is also a good reminder that even though I've been using the word bird language all night long, we can't really talk about one bird language. There are 10,000 different bird languages. Every single species has its own language. And if you want to figure out what the birds are saying, you have to learn each species' language individually. It's a daunting task. That brings us to the books that I wrote. The Peterson Field Guide to Bird Sounds, split into 2 volumes for Eastern and Western North America. When I wrote the book, I was hoping that it would be a dictionary for the language of the birds so that you could actually figure out what the birds are saying to one another. Of course, as I mentioned earlier tonight, a lot of times we don't know. So the little phrase, "more study needed," appears hundreds of times in each of those volumes of the book. But when we do know something, I tried to put it in there. So you can learn what each species is saying. Another goal of mine in writing these books was to get us all using a standard vocabulary for sounds. I wanted to make sure that we were actually using the same words to describe what we hear. We already have a shared vocabulary to talk about what birds look like, and it's highly developed. We all agree on the names of the parts of the bird. This is something you learn when you pick up your first field guide. There's actually a diagram in the opening of the field guide that labels the parts of the bird so that we all are going to use the same words to mean the same part. And we all agree on the names of the colors, and we all agree on the names of the patterns. For example, we all agree on the difference between a spot and a stripe. There's absolutely no reason we couldn't do the same thing for sounds. It's just that we haven't yet. We haven't all sat down and agreed what language we're actually going to use to describe bird sounds. I tried to do that. I described all the sounds in my books using a consistent vocabulary. I tried not to invent too many new words. I tried to keep it to words that people were already using, but just define them specifically. Another cool thing that the book allows you to do is to compare similar sounding species. So if you see the spectrogram of a bird sound in the book, under every spectrogram, there's a little page number at lower right, or more than one. And that'll send you to an index in the back of the book where it has a list of all the other birds that sound similar to that. So for example, if you're hearing something and it sounds kind of like a red-winged blackbird, but it's not quite a red-winged blackbird, you can go and see what else might sound like a red-winged blackbird. And you can kind of rule some of them out. Some of those might not be here. Some of those might be wrong habitat. You might be able to narrow it down pretty quickly like that. And that allows you to look up a sound you don't know. So in the inside back cover of the book, there's this quick index that asks, what did you hear? And over here on the left, this left-hand column, these are all the single notes. And then the second column is the same note repeated over and over again. And then all the more complicated patterns are over on the right. And you look at this and you can match what you heard to this quick description. And then you'll see these little page numbers, and you can go to the index and see what kinds of different groups of birds would sound like that. And now we can actually do even more cool stuff than that with apps on our phones. We can use our phones to generate spectrograms of the birds while they're singing in the field. And there's a number of different apps that will do that. The one I like most for this purpose is called Song Sleuth. It's now free for both iPhone and Android. And if you turn on Song Sleuth and use it to point it at a bird, as soon as you turn it on, it'll start scrolling a real-time spectrogram of everything that the phone is hearing. And you can just use your finger to pause that recording or to unpause it, to zoom in either direction. So you can zoom in on the bird sound, get more detail on it. And then there's a record button in the center of the screen at lower center. So you can just start recording that bird sound whenever you want. And then come back and look at the spectrogram or play the bird sound later. Now, this app tries to identify birds for you in your bird sounds. It's not super great at it, so I don't use that function in this app. But now we have the Merlin app that is better at identifying bird sounds. It's not perfect. It will miss a lot of stuff, and sometimes it will just flat out misidentify things, but it's pretty good. I was using it in Texas a bunch when I was down there for the festival in November. I've used it around Colorado. I tend to, for loud birds that are close to the phone, it tends to get those with about 80 to 90% accuracy. So that's pretty cool. If you want to, the automatic apps are not yet perfect for bird sound identification for a whole bunch of reasons. Merlin only recognizes the 450 most common bird species from North America at present. It does not recognize them all with equal accuracy. Sometimes it might recognize the song of the species, but not the call, for example. And it tends to make the same kind of mistakes that humans make. So if two bird sounds sound pretty similar, and humans might mix them up, Merlin might mix them up as well. One of the things you can do if you're going to use a spectrogram app like Song Sleuth to take a picture of a bird sound while it's in the field is that once you've got that picture of the bird sound, you can actually open up the Peterson Field Guide to Bird Sounds and match a picture to a picture. You can turn audio identification into a visual challenge, which for a lot of us makes it a lot easier, which is very cool and exciting. I should also mention that there's a website, petersonbirdsounds.com, where you can listen to over 7,500 bird sounds from the book. If I do say so myself, it's the most complete and best curated set of bird sounds ever put together for North American birds. If you go to the website, it looks like this. You can type the species name in at the bottom that you're interested in. And if you say type in northern mockingbird, this is what you'll get. And you can see that we have several different examples of each different kind of sound. It tells you which kind of sound it is. And then when you click on one of them to listen, it'll actually scroll the spectrogram past you as you are listening to the sound. So it's a wonderful way to learn spectrograms. It is by watching the shapes go by and hearing the sound at the exact same time. this is hosted by our friends at the Macaulay Library, so it's the same engine that you see on eBird. So that's petersonbirdsounds.com. These are the Peterson Field Guides to bird sounds. One question that is probably going to come up here for Travis Audubon is, if you want a copy of that Peterson Field Guide, which one should you pick for Central Texas? And the answer is the Eastern Guide. So the Hill Country and Travis County and Austin, those are all going to be in the Eastern North American Guide. And then if you get out to Big Bend area, that part of West Texas, then you're going to be in the Western Guide. But everything else should be in the Eastern Guide. So that is my prepared remarks for the evening. And thank you very much for listening to me. At this point, I am happy to discuss questions that you may have. And I understand that I think Jane and some other people are going to be curating the chat feed and pulling out questions for me, and we'll go from there.
Well, that was wonderful. It's a really engaging talk, and we appreciate your initiative in basically creating a whole new area of study. Oh my gosh, it's very impressive. But we do have lots of questions. People were very excited all through your talk. So going back to the very beginning, do non-colonial birds talk about sharing food? The mountain chickadees in my Buena Vista, Colorado backyard have pegged me as the peanut lady and vocalize. I've been wondering if they're trying to communicate with me when I hear them close by or with each other.
So that's a good question. Birds don't have to be colonial nesters in order to share food resources. So for example, chickadees often move in flocks, especially in the winter. And those flocks have kind of a pecking order with an alpha male and an alpha female, and then a second ranked male and a second ranked female. They have a whole ranking system, but they're all they're moving together. So part of staying together is being able to exploit food resources together. And for that reason, I think it's kind of like the more eyes you have to spot danger. Also, the more eyes you have to find food. And so there are lots of birds that'll cooperate with one another, whether or not they nest colonially or not. But there's also many, many bird species that don't share food resources from one individual to another. So depends on the species. That's a good question.
So they're probably communicating with each other, not to the peanut lady, right?
They're most likely communicating with each other and not to the human.
Yeah. Okay.
There might be some exceptions to that, but that's probably more likely than not.
Okay. Is there a regional difference in the song for I Found Food in Cliff Swallow?
I guess I would have to say that we don't know enough about that particular call. I found an old scientific paper describing this call and all of the experiments that they had done to record it. I think back in the late 80s or early 90s, they discovered this call and they published it in a scientific journal. And then nobody did anything with it until I found that paper when I was researching my book. And I couldn't get a hold of those original recordings, but I was able to go out and on a cloudy day here in Colorado and record cliff swallows doing sounds kind of like this. And some of them matched the spectrogram in that paper. So not very many people have recordings of this kind of call. You have to kind of like be deliberately aware of that call and be trying to record that call in order to record it. The thing is that it's hard to distinguish the food finding call in cliff swallow from like brief snippets of cliff swallow song. So I gave you a really nice example of the breep kind of version of it, but there's many different versions that one bird will give. So while they're on that cloudy day, when they're all swarming around, you can follow one individual bird. Like I would follow one bird with my microphone and it would be giving different versions of the call every time that it opened its mouth. So there's definitely variation within individuals, a lot of it. And I'm not even sure it's necessarily a call. It might be a kind of song. It might be a kind of snippet of Cliff Swallow's song that is actually sending this message. So we don't know much about regional variation in that call because it's so individually variable and because we have so few recordings of it.
Okay, here's someone who's asking if you would talk a little bit about Chickadee language. She or he has had some extraordinary experiences with black-capped chickadees over several years. And we'd just like to know a little more.
Well, chickadees are one of those birds, kind of like red-winged blackbirds, where I could give a whole talk just on chickadee language. There's a lot going on in chickadees. First of all, every single species of chickadee in North America has at least 2 different kinds of songs. And 3 of those species, the mountain chickadee, Carolina chickadee, and black-capped chickadee, they have 3 different kinds of songs if you want to count the Chickadee Call. So that's what a lot of people consider the standard song of black-capped chickadee. That's kind of like a mating kind of mate attraction kind of song, and the males will get into song duels. You may have heard them giving song duels where they will sing on different pitches. So that's a duel between rival males. They're trying to outsing one another when they're doing that. A lot of birds like mockingbirds or brown thrashers, they would duel by throwing different phrases at one another. And male black-capped chickadees do it by throwing different pitches of the same song at each other. That's the only bird I know of that does it that way, which is really cool. But they also have the Chickadee Call, which is a very complex call consisting of 4 different kinds of notes, always given in the same order, A, B, C, and D, but they can leave out any of the notes that they want, and they can give any number of notes. They would never put the notes out of order, but they can vary the number of notes and they can leave them out entirely. And different combinations of note types and note numbers send very different messages. And we're just starting to crack that code. There's a whole bunch there's already been some research showing that like different forms of the Chickadee Call are given in response to different predators, for example. And then there's another call called another song called the gurgle song, which is the kind of like the more gurgling, complex little trilled sound that they make. That's actually kind of like their primary song that they give. And then each individual male has a bunch of different versions that he knows. They have a repertoire of gurgle songs. That's just a quick starter on just a very brief toe dipped in the water of chickadee communication. There's a lot going on with chickadees. Fascinating birds.
Wonderful. Someone wants to know about if you would talk about male and female cardinal pairs duets, how they echo each other, and how did they make up such incredible compositions?
Well, I'll answer the second question first. How do they make up such incredible compositions? I have no idea. And I don't know that anybody knows that one. That's a great question. One thing that I'd like to point out, since this came up, you're probably familiar with the fact that both male and female cardinals sing. And one of the reasons we can tell that is because it's easy to tell male and female cardinals apart by looking at them. In a lot of birds, the males and the females look identical. And a lot of us have the assumption or make the assumption that if a bird is singing, it's probably a male. Generally speaking, that's not always a safe assumption. There are lots and lots of female birds out there that sing. Some of them sing just as much and just as well, or as give the same kinds of songs as males. And that includes cardinals and rose-breasted and black-headed grosbeaks, Female orioles are singing constantly. Some certain female wrens have their own songs, like canyon wren females, for example, have a different song than the male that you can learn to tell them apart if you listen to it. So female birds sing a lot. And then when it comes to cardinals, I don't know a whole lot about their duetting behavior, but I do know that both male and female cardinals frequently sing. And this is probably because they are resident. So many birds in the tropics that don't migrate, the male and the female both have to defend the territory year round. And so they both go on song duty in order to defend the territory, if that makes sense. But there's probably also some pair bonding involved in it. So it's probably both of those things at the same time, right? Just like we saw on the red-winged blackbirds. I love you / this territory is taken. They're probably doing both of those when the male and the female cardinal are duetting.
Okay, I think that kind of answered our next question, which was wondering if you could do a breakdown of the cardinal songs and what they mean, but I think you've addressed that. So you made the point about the size of the brown thrasher's vocabulary and compared it to the mockingbird. How do we know that all of the phrases these birds sing have meaning and therefore are vocabulary as opposed to just phrases they are singing? The mockingbird does mock other calls, but how do we know it has meaning? A better example is the Australian lyrebird, which is renowned for its ability to mimic. But do those sounds actually mean something?
The short answer there is we don't know. We don't know for sure that all of the sounds are meaningful. It's possible that the listeners are cued on certain sounds, certain words in the language, if it were, or certain phrases in the song, and taking meaning from those. Now, when it comes to imitation, as lyrebirds do and as mockingbirds do, one of the ways that the mockingbird actually is encoding its own message, at least the message "I am a mockingbird," but probably also the message, I'm looking for a mate. I'm defending my territory. The mockingbirds encode that message into their song, even when they are imitating other species. So if you think about it, when a mockingbird is imitating a Carolina wren, the mockingbird does not want to be mistaken for a Carolina wren. That would have two bad consequences as far as the mockingbird is concerned. First of all, it would get attacked by angry Carolina wrens. It does not want that. Secondly, it would be ignored by other mockingbirds. It does not want that either. So what it does is it repeats. It takes a phrase of Carolina wren song and it repeats it 5 or 6 or 8 times. And then it picks some other phrase and repeats that 6 or 8 times. And then it picks some other phrase and repeats that 6 or 8 times. That's how humans know that it's a mockingbird instead of a Carolina wren. That's also how Carolina wrens know, and it's also how mockingbirds know. That's how they recognize each other. And so when mockingbirds are pulling sounds from other species, they're not trying to say what that bird is saying. They're not trying to be mistaken for that bird. Instead, they're doing what human DJs do when they're sampling another artist's art. They found something that they liked and they pulled a snippet of it and they incorporated it into their own original composition that has its own mockingbird syntax to it. And so the relationship of those imitated sounds to each other in time sends that mockingbird message. I hope that answers your question up to the point that I can answer it.
Okay, are the brown thrasher song phrases newly learned each year, or are they retained from previous years?
That is actually one of the big questions that I think needs to be answered about brown thrasher song phrases. We don't know whether those, that 2,000 to 2,500 different song phrases, that's an estimate. But we don't know whether some of those might be improvised. Some of them might be made up on the spot and then never repeated ever. The bird might be riffing like a jazz artist instead of like remembering 22,000 different sounds and deploying them. We do know that at least some of those phrases are memorized. So the bird will sing a phrase, and then you might hear that exact same phrase from the bird 10 minutes later or 2 hours later or the next day. So at least some of those words in the phrases in brown thrasher's song are permanent, or they're learned. But we don't know the extent to which they might be improvising. Most bird species learn their whole song repertoire in their first year of life. And come their first spring on their first territory, their brain changes, it locks in whatever they've learned so far, and from then on until they die, they cannot learn any more new sounds. That is the way it works in most species of birds that do learn their sounds. Some birds don't learn sounds at all. They just inherit their sounds genetically from their parents. But in those species that do learn their sounds, the vast majority of those species have 1 year of critical learning, and then whatever they learn in that first year, they're done. They cannot learn for the rest of their lives. They cannot learn new sounds. We know that mockingbirds are an exception to that rule. Mockingbirds can continue learning new sounds throughout their lives. We know that parrots, unsurprisingly, can continue learning new sounds throughout their lives. It would stand to reason that brown thrashers, since they're closely related to mockingbirds, can probably continue to learn new sounds throughout their lives. But no one has yet done that research. No one has researched brown thrasher song at all, as far as I can tell, since the early 1980s. There's just a lot of bird sound research left to do.
Okay, is it true that many birds are fairly quiet except when they are breeding?
Yes, that's that's kind of a simple answer. Yes, there are some birds that never vocalize unless they are at the colony or around the nest, and there are some birds that that vocalize a lot. But yeah, in a lot of species, the majority of the vocal activity ends up being during the breeding season, and especially in close relationship with either the mate or the nest.
Okay. So here's an app-related question. I don't see ladderback woodpecker in the app. If I were to supply the info, could that be added? Not sure.
In which app?
I'm not sure.
Maybe that
We
person
might have to come back to that because they might respond and tell us which app they were talking about. So I'll move on.
I will just say this. So if you go on the website to the Merlin Vision website, they will have a list of all the species if you're talking about the Merlin app from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, the one that tries to automatically identify sounds, they'll list all the species on that. I can probably put the link to that website in the chat if I can find it. I'd have to look for it for a second. But they have a list of all the species that Merlin can currently identify. And they also have a list that like it'll tell you currently the accuracy with which Merlin can identify each species. So you can sort them from the ones that Merlin knows best to the ones that it doesn't know yet very well. And the reason that they have put this information on the web is because they want you and everybody on this call, they want you to go out and record more sounds from those species and then upload those recordings to eBird. Because if you upload your recordings on an eBird checklist, then that can train the artificial intelligence. They have found that they need at least 100 recordings of one species in order to train the artificial intelligence to consistently be able to identify that species. And we simply don't have enough recordings of everything yet. So yes, uploading more recordings is going to make Merlin and other apps better.
Okay. Crows are considered extremely smart in the bird world, yet they do not seem to have a complicated language to the casual observer. Is this not true, or do they communicate non-verbally?
Oh man, crows. So crows are scary smart. In case you haven't heard, crows are communicating all sorts of complicated messages to one another. Somehow, they're probably doing it visually too, but somehow they're doing it vocally as well. And to our ear, it all sounds more or less like caw. But somehow they are able to like tell one another very, very complicated things. Like they can communicate to their, like if you ever hurt a crow, all the other crows will remember you. They will remember that you hurt a crow one time. They will remember your face. If you change clothes or whatever, they will still remember you. And they will harass you every time they see you. And they can communicate to the next generation of crows that you were a bad human being. How they can do that using just words that sound just like caw to our ears, we still have no idea. Presumably, there are presumably there are very fine gradations of message that are being communicated within that caw, and we have not cracked that code yet at all.
Perfect. I have heard brown thrashers whisper singing, which makes me wonder about the significance of the volume of songs and calls. How much do birds alter their singing or call volume?
They can alter their volume a lot. When they're doing something that's called whisper singing, that can be one of two things. One thing that it can be is it can be a young bird practicing. It's a bird in its first year of life. It hasn't yet learned all of its songs. It has to practice them and hear itself singing before it can really lock that in. And we call that subsong. And often it's very soft and kind of rambling. And you will hear like song sparrows during the wintertime singing this kind of long, complicated song that doesn't really sound like song sparrow song. It kind of gradually turns into something that's recognizably song sparrow song over the course of the winter, as that individual bird gets better and better at what it's practicing. But a lot of times they don't really want to be detected. They're just trying to like practice it so they can hear it. So they're doing it like in a bush, low volume, and that's a young bird. But then also adult birds will sometimes do these whisper songs. And when they do these whisper songs, it's usually because they are in some kind of high intensity situation. Either they are really excited about something or they're really upset about something. So for example, there was a guy who researched veeries, and he found that when two male veeries get into a really high intensity territorial conflict, instead of making their songs louder, they make their songs softer, but they get right up close to one another. And so his hypothesis was that by singing soft, because a veery lives in a forest where there's lots of echoes off the leaves and trunks. And if you're really close and you're kind of like whispering to somebody and they can still hear you and it sounds very clear and there's no echo, that's like a high threat message saying, I'm really close to you. You don't want me to have to come over there, and come the rest of that distance. It's kind of like if you made your mom really mad and her voice got quiet and you knew you were in really big trouble. Like when the voice gets quiet, you're in bigger trouble than when the voice is loud. That is something that has been hypothesized for certain bird species as well. And there's also like high intensity close courtship between a male and a female, where like it's kind of like whispering in your lover's ear. You'll hear that too in terms of whisper songs as well. So there can be a lot of reasons why birds will vary their volume. I'll just say this too: certain birds, flammulated owl is a great example. They will, if another flammulated owl shows up in the territory, and that male, the first thing that male on territory will do is it'll approach. But when it approaches, it will approach in a straight line, and then it will fly in really close, and then it'll start vocalizing softly. So it sounds like the bird hasn't moved, but it's actually like right there looking at you. And if you're out there like playing a tape for a flammulated owl, you'll hear it off in the distance. You'll try to play a tape to try and draw it in. You'll think, oh man, it's not coming in. But actually it's like right up there in the tree looking down at you, just still hooting. but very softly, so that you don't realize that it's come in.
Why do blue jays do the red-shouldered hawk and Cooper's hawk sounds?
So we don't know. Why jays imitate hawks is a matter of quite a bit of debate among those who study jays and bird sounds. Some hypotheses I've heard are that jays might be trying to scare other birds into an alarm reaction so that those birds might reveal, say, the location of their nests so that the blue jays can go and raid the nests. Some people have hypothesized that blue jays might be drawing attention to a silent hawk that's in the area, vocalizing for it so that everybody else knows that it's there, for example. Neither of those two examples or explanations really fit the data that I have, because when I hear blue jays imitating hawks, around here it's usually red-tailed hawks that they're imitating in Colorado. But when I hear jays imitating hawks, first of all, it's usually a lone jay. It's usually in the fall or winter, not during the breeding season. And there's almost never a hawk around that I can detect when this is happening. So I have no idea, and I don't think anybody has a good explanation for why jays imitate hawks. And they could, because they're jays, because they're corvids, they have a large vocabulary, very good at imitating. They could imitate other kinds of birds, but they pretty much stick to hawks. And it's blue jays, stellar jays, and gray jays that really pretty much stick to hawks, except the gray jays will also imitate sandpipers for some reason. So for gray jays, it's hawks and sandpipers, and for blue jays and stellar jays, it's pretty much hawks. Why? We don't really know.
Okay, so just a few more questions. Why do northern mockingbirds give a whispering song, and under what circumstances do they use this behavior?
So I would basically say the same thing that I said about whisper songs earlier. If you're hearing a mockingbird vocalizing very, very softly, it's probably either a young bird practicing, or it's some kind of high intensity courtship, close courtship situation, or possibly a close aggressive territorial interaction, although I would lean toward the courtship for mimids most likely.
Are a lot of bird sounds outside the range of human hearing?
So no. If you're going to define human hearing as what a very young human with really good ears can hear, up to 20 kilohertz, the answer is basically we're unaware of any birds that make sounds that are outside of that range. Now, there's a lot of birds that make sounds that I can't hear because my high-pitched hearing is, my ceiling is getting lower and lower every year. I already have to wear hearing aids and they don't help that much. So, I saw cedar waxwings today. I did not hear cedar waxwings today. Cedar waxwings have to be like sitting right over my head before I can hear them. And at a certain point, I'm going to lose that too. Like I'm not going to even hear them if they're right over my head. So depends on the human, but like the range of human hearing, if you're talking about like young people with really good ears, they can hear everything that birds can do, because their range of hearing and our range of hearing is pretty much the same.
Okay. If young birds are deprived of hearing their parents' songs, do they never learn the songs in a lab setting, for example?
That is exactly right. That with the caveat that applies only to those species that learn their songs. Some species do not learn their songs. For example, flycatchers. So this experiment has been done with eastern phoebes in the lab. Donald Kreutzma brought eastern phoebes, baby, eggs of eastern phoebe into the lab, hatched them out, raised those birds, never allowed them to hear an eastern phoebe song. In some cases, they actually played them like eastern wood pewee songs or other species songs. It didn't matter. Eastern phoebes, no matter what they hear, they will grow up to sing just like their parents did because their songs are genetically controlled. But if you do the same thing with a white-crowned sparrow, which learns its song, if you never allow a baby white-crowned sparrow to hear white-crowned sparrow song, it's not going to produce a proper white-crowned sparrow song. It's never going to actually learn that. So birds that learn their songs, they do need to hear their species song, and then they need to practice it. And occasionally it can be that a young bird in the wild will learn the song of the wrong species. That has happened in a number of different examples.
Okay, I'm supposed to stop there, but I do have a question that I think is really important. That's from somebody who wants to know if they should, well, any recommendations for recording onto iPhone for Merlin to help build the library / train AI when there are city noises in the background, or just do it anyway and let it be figured out, sorted out later?
Do it anyway, sort it out later. Yes, that's the answer. In part because Merlin needs to learn to recognize birds even when they're singing in cities. It needs to learn them. It needs to learn to recognize birds even when like 3 species are singing all at the same time, right? Those are some of the situations in which Merlin currently gets confused sometimes. And if we had more recordings like that over time, it'll get better at recording those. So yes, absolutely. Just record first and sort it out later. I'm going to put a link in the chat to, if I can here, to everyone. Here's that Merlin Vision website I was talking about. So that's the one that talks about which bird species Merlin can identify. And if you are good at identifying bird sounds and you want to be one of the people that helps train Merlin, it talks to you there about how you can volunteer to help annotate recordings. And it'll also give you the list of like the high priority species. If you sort it properly, it'll tell you which ones. And certain birds like northern mockingbird, unsurprisingly, are really, we have a lot of recordings of northern mockingbird, but because northern mockingbirds make a million different sounds, it's a bird that Merlin has trouble learning. So it's going to take way more than 100 recordings to really get good at recording, at identifying mockingbirds. So even some very common birds that are supposedly on the list of 450 already that it can identify actually are also on the priority list for recordings. And then I will just put one other link in the chat for those of you who are interested in getting more into recording with anything other than your phone, although you can totally use your phone. There is a page on the Macaulay Library website where they talk about like what kinds of hardware and software you might want to use if you want to get more into audio recording. So that's the second link that I just put in the chat right there.
Well, I think that's all the questions we have time for tonight. And Nicole, are you going to say our farewells?
Yes, I wanted to thank Nathan so much for being with us, and thanks to all of you for joining us. We hope to see you again on February 17th when we'll have our next meeting. So thanks everybody and good night.
It was great.
It was fantastic.
Appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
175 people.